Rachel Morrison stood in the conference room of Morrison Global Industries, presenting quarterly reports to the executive board, completely unaware that her husband, the quiet, gentle man she'd just divorced 3 months ago, was the multi-billionaire owner sitting in the shadows of the private observation deck above her. But as she laughed with her new husband, James Holloway, the company's supposed CFO, and her ex-husband's former best friend, about how she'd finally upgraded from that pathetic, struggling nobody Ethan Morrison, she had no idea that the disabled child she'd abandoned with him, their 7-year-old daughter Emma, who used a wheelchair, was about to inherit half the company in a trust fund worth $8.3 billion that would activate the moment Rachel signed those final divorce papers. The severance package Rachel thought she was negotiating as a senior analyst? It was actually her exit from a fortune she'd never known existed, one her ex-husband had deliberately hidden throughout their entire 8-year marriage, watching, waiting to see if she'd love him without the money. And she'd failed his test spectacularly. But what Ethan Morrison did next, in front of 300 employees and the woman who'd called their disabled daughter a burden she could no longer carry, would shock Rachel so completely that she'd realized too late she hadn't just divorced a man. She'd divorced an empire, a legacy, and the only person who'd ever truly protected her from herself. How did Ethan hide a multi-billion-dollar empire from his own wife for 8 years? Why did his best friend James betray him? And what revelation was about to destroy Rachel's new marriage before it even truly began? The fluorescent lights of Morrison Global Industries' 20th floor cast harsh shadows across Rachel Morrison's face as she adjusted her presentation clicker. She'd worked at this company for 6 years, climbing from junior analyst to senior financial consultant, never once questioning why her performance reviews were always exceptional or why her salary increased precisely when she needed it most. She smoothed her burgundy dress, the expensive one James had bought her last week, and smiled at the executive board members filing into the conference room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this quarterly review," Rachel began, her voice steady and professional. She'd practiced this presentation for weeks, desperate to impress the senior leadership now that she was finally free from the dead weight that had been dragging her down. Ethan. God, just thinking his name made her stomach turn with a mixture of guilt and relief. Their marriage had been a slow death, or so she'd told herself. 8 years of watching him work his consulting job from home, 8 years of modest living in their comfortable but unremarkable 3-bedroom house in the suburbs, 8 years of him insisting they didn't need luxury cars or exotic vacations. And then Emma was born, beautiful and perfect, until the doctors delivered the diagnosis that changed everything. A rare genetic condition that affected her mobility, confining her to a wheelchair, requiring endless therapy sessions and medical appointments that Ethan always seemed available for, always patient, always present. But Rachel had grown tired of being present. She'd grown tired of the pitying looks from other mothers at Emma's school, tired of the medical bills that Ethan somehow always managed to pay without stress or complaint. Tired of a husband who seemed content with simplicity when she craved more. When James Holloway, the charismatic CFO of Morrison Global Industries, had started paying attention to her during late-night work sessions, something inside Rachel had awakened, or perhaps died, depending on who was telling the story. James was everything Ethan wasn't: ambitious, flashy, commanding. He drove a Porsche, wore custom Italian suits, and took her to restaurants where entrees cost more than her weekly grocery budget. He'd whispered promises of a better life, a life without the burden of a disabled child, a life where she could finally be free. And Rachel, drowning in resentment she'd cultivated for years, had listened. The divorce papers had been filed 4 months ago. Ethan hadn't fought her. He'd simply looked at her with those calm gray eyes that had once made her feel safe and said, "If this is what you truly want, Rachel, I won't stand in your way. But Emma stays with me. I won't have her feeling abandoned by her mother." Rachel had readily agreed, ashamed of how relieved she'd felt. James had helped her move into his penthouse apartment downtown, and 2 months later, they'd married in a small ceremony in the Bahamas. Now standing before the Morrison Global Industries Executive Board, Rachel felt truly alive for the first time in years. She clicked through her presentation slides, highlighting profit margins and growth projections. Unaware that in the private observation deck directly above the conference room, separated by sophisticated one-way glass, her ex-husband sat watching her performance. Ethan Morrison looked nothing like the man Rachel had divorced. Gone was the casual cardigan and worn jeans. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, his dark hair styled impeccably, his presence radiating the quiet authority of a man who'd built a global empire from nothing. Next to him sat his attorney, Patricia Valdez, and his younger sister, Diana Morrison Chen, who'd been begging him for months to reveal the truth to Rachel before the divorce was finalized. "She still has no idea," Diana whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. 8 years, Ethan. 8 years you've hidden this from her." Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched Rachel laugh at something James said, saw the way his former best friend's hand lingered on her waist. "I needed to know if she'd love me without it. I grew up watching people destroy each other over money, Diana. You remember what happened to Mom and Dad? I swore I'd never let wealth define my relationships." "But she divorced you anyway," Patricia interjected quietly, "and she abandoned Emma." "Which tells me everything I needed to know," Ethan replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "The trust fund activates today. Emma will inherit $4.1 billion on her 18th birthday with full access to her medical trust immediately. Rachel signed away her rights to any of it when she signed those divorce papers. She wanted freedom from her family. I'm giving it to her." Below them, Rachel was wrapping up her presentation, basking in the polite applause from executives who knew exactly who she was and what she'd done. What she didn't know was that every person in that room reported directly to the man she'd called a struggling nobody just 3 months ago. The memory hit Ethan with unexpected force as he watched Rachel gather her presentation materials, their daughter's 3rd birthday party, before the diagnosis, when Emma had run through their backyard chasing bubbles, her laughter bright and pure. Rachel had been different then, or perhaps he'd simply been blind to who she really was. She cradled Emma in her arms that night and whispered, "She's perfect, Ethan. She's absolutely perfect." 2 years later, when the doctors explained that Emma would likely never walk without assistance, that her condition was progressive and would require lifelong care, Rachel's whispers had changed. "This isn't what I signed up for," she'd said one night, thinking Ethan was asleep. "This isn't the life I wanted." Ethan had lain awake in the darkness, listening to his wife's quiet sobs, and made a decision that would define the next 3 years. He would never tell her about the money, not about Morrison Global Industries, the company his grandfather had founded and his father had destroyed through negligence before Ethan rebuilt it from near bankruptcy at age 25. Not about the real estate portfolio spanning 17 countries, not about the venture capital firm that had backed 43 successful startups. None of it. He'd hired James Holloway himself 6 years ago when Morrison Global Industries needed a new CFO. James had been brilliant with numbers, but weak in character. Ethan had known this from their college days, but believed people could change. He'd been wrong. The first time Ethan noticed the way James looked at Rachel during the company Christmas party 3 years ago, something in his gut had warned him. But he'd dismissed it, trusted his friend, trusted his wife. What a fool he'd been. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia's voice cut through his memories, "the board meeting is about to adjourn. Are you ready to proceed with the announcement?" Ethan straightened his tie and stood. At 6'2", he cut an imposing figure. Though Rachel had spent years telling him to stand up straighter, to act more confident, to be more like successful men. If she only knew. Have security prepared. When James realizes what's happening, he'll likely become volatile. I want Rachel escorted out safely. I won't have her harmed despite everything. Diana touched his arm gently. You still care about her. I care about the woman I thought she was, Ethan corrected. That woman doesn't exist. But I won't be cruel, Diana. That's not who I am. Down in the conference room, Rachel was packing her leather portfolio when James's phone buzzed. She watched his face drain of color as he read the message. James, what's wrong? Emergency board meeting, he muttered, his hands trembling slightly. I'm being called to the executive suite. Top floor. That's never happened before. Rachel squeezed his arm reassuringly. You're the CFO. It's probably just some routine matter. You've got this. But James's expression suggested he knew it was anything but routine. In truth, he'd received a cryptic message from the CEO's office. A CEO whose identity was known only to the board's inner circle. A CEO who communicated through proxies and had never once appeared at company headquarters in person, according to company legend. James had always assumed it was some reclusive old man, perhaps dying, managing the empire from afar. He was about to discover how catastrophically wrong he'd been. The executive elevator required a biometric scan that James's CFO credentials barely granted access to. As the elevator climbed past floors he'd worked on for 6 years, past departments he'd overseen, James felt a creeping dread he couldn't explain. Rachel had wanted to come with him, but security had politely insisted this meeting was for C-suite executives only. She'd kissed him goodbye in the lobby, promising to wait at the cafe across the street. When the elevator doors opened on the 45th floor, a floor James hadn't even known existed in the building, he stepped into a reception area that screamed wealth in whispers, original Rothko paintings on the walls, hand-carved mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. A woman in an impeccable navy suit gestured him forward. "Mr. Holloway, the board is waiting. This way." James followed her down a hallway lined with photographs he'd never seen before. Morrison Global Industries through the decades, construction projects in Dubai, tech campuses in Silicon Valley, philanthropic galas attended by presidents and prime ministers. And in several of the photos, standing beside dignitaries and celebrities, was a face that made James's blood run cold. Ethan Morrison, Rachel's ex-husband. The man James had convinced her was a nobody, a failure, a burden she needed to shed. In every photograph, Ethan wore the same quiet confidence, the same understated elegance, the same barely perceptible smile of a man who knew exactly how powerful he was and felt no need to prove it. The boardroom doors opened, and James Holloway stepped into his worst nightmare. Seated at the head of a table that could accommodate 30 people were the 7 members of Morrison Global Industries Executive Board, people James had seen only in company communications, never in person. And standing at the window, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, was Ethan Morrison, though he looked nothing like the man James had known. "Please sit down, James," Ethan said without turning around, his voice carrying an authority James had never heard before. "We have a great deal to discuss." "Ethan, what the hell is going on? What are you doing here?" "I work here," Ethan replied simply, finally turning to face his former friend. "I've always worked here. In fact, I own here. Morrison Global Industries. Morrison. My grandfather, Theodore Morrison, founded this company in 1952. My father nearly destroyed it by 1998. I rebuilt it by 2010. You've been working for me for 6 years, James. The entire time you've been sleeping with my wife and poisoning her against me, you've been cashing paychecks that I signed." The room spun. James gripped the edge of the conference table. "That's impossible. You were just a nobody," Ethan supplied coldly. "Yes, that's what you told Rachel. That's what you convinced her to believe. Tell me, James, when did you first decide to betray me? Was it the Christmas party 3 years ago, when you saw an unhappy woman and sensed opportunity? Or was it earlier, when you started skimming from the corporate accounts, thinking no one would notice?" James's face went chalk white. "I don't know what you're talking about." Patricia Valdez pushed a thick folder across the table. "We have documentation of 17 separate instances of financial fraud totaling $2.3 million over the past 4 years. You've been very clever, Mr. Holloway, routing funds through shell corporations, creating fake vendor accounts. But not clever enough." "This is insane," James sputtered, though his eyes told the truth. He thought he was stealing from some faceless corporation, some bureaucratic entity that would never miss the money. The realization that he'd been stealing from Ethan Morrison, that every fraudulent transaction had likely been monitored, cataloged, and saved for this exact moment, made his stomach revolt. Ethan moved closer, and James instinctively leaned back. There was something different about Ethan now, something dangerous lurking beneath that calm exterior. "I knew about the affair within 2 weeks of it starting," Ethan said quietly. I had private investigators document every hotel room, every dinner, every lie you told Rachel about me. I could have stopped it, but I needed to see how far you'd both go. I needed to know if the woman I loved would abandon our disabled daughter for money and status, or if there was something worth saving in her. She doesn't know who you are, James whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. You've been testing her, and she failed spectacularly. Ethan's voice carried no emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying. Rachel chose you, James. She chose your Porsche and your penthouse and your empty promises over her own child, over Emma, who asks me every night why mommy doesn't love her anymore. Do you know what I tell her? I tell her that sometimes people can't see what's truly valuable until it's gone. Diana Morrison Chen spoke from her seat at the table, her voice cutting. You have two choices, Mr. Holloway. You can resign immediately, accept a settlement of $250,000, far more than you deserve, and leave the country within 72 hours. Or we can press charges for embezzlement, fraud, and a dozen other crimes that will send you to federal prison for 15 to 20 years. Your choice. James looked frantically between the board members, searching for sympathy and finding none. Rachel? Does Rachel know? She's about to, Ethan said, checking his watch. In fact, I've arranged for her to receive a very specific education this afternoon. Every employee in this building, all 300 people currently working, is about to receive an email with my biography, my photographs, and a detailed explanation of my relationship to this company. By the time Rachel checks her phone, she'll understand exactly what she threw away. You can't do this to her, James protested, and immediately regretted it when Ethan's eyes flashed dangerously. I can't. I've just offered you a lifeline you don't deserve, James. Take it or don't. But make your decision in the next 60 seconds, because Rachel is currently sitting in the cafe across the street, and I'm about to join her for a conversation that's 3 months overdue. James signed the resignation papers with shaking hands, knowing his life as he'd known it was over. As security escorted him to collect his personal belongings, Ethan Morrison prepared to face the woman who'd divorced him without ever knowing who he truly was. Rachel Morrison sat in the corner booth of Stellar Cafe, scrolling through her phone while waiting for James to finish his mysterious meeting. The cafe was unusually crowded for a Wednesday afternoon, filled with Morrison Global Industries employees on their lunch breaks. She'd ordered a cappuccino and was debating whether to splurge on a croissant when her phone buzzed with an email notification. From Morrison Global Industries, Corporate Communications. Subject: Important leadership announcement. Rachel almost deleted it. She received dozens of corporate emails daily, but something about the subject line made her pause. She opened it, and the first words made her coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips. Dear MGI family, it is with great pride that we formally introduce you to our CEO and majority shareholder, Ethan Theodore Morrison. The phone nearly slipped from her hands. There was a photograph attached. Ethan at a corporate podium, wearing an immaculate suit, shaking hands with the governor of California. Another photo showed him cutting a ribbon at a hospital opening, the Morrison Children's Medical Center, a facility Rachel suddenly remembered Emma attending for her therapy sessions. Therapy sessions that had never generated a single medical bill. Rachel's hands trembled as she scrolled through the email. Her ex-husband's biography read like fiction. Stanford MBA at 23, youngest CEO of a Fortune 500 company at 28, named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people 2 years ago. The company's valuation, $47 billion. Ethan's personal net worth, estimated at $16.8 billion. The cafe walls seemed to close in around her. Memories flooded back with painful clarity. Ethan working from his home office, which she'd mocked as playing computer games. His consulting job, which she'd dismissed as barely adequate. The way he'd always been available for Emma's appointments, never stressed about money, never worried when unexpected expenses arose. The house they'd lived in, she'd thought it modest, but now she remembered it was in Waverly Hills, one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. She'd just assumed Ethan had gotten lucky with a rental. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from her colleague, Amanda Prescott. OMG, Rachel, did you see the email? Your ex-husband is the Ethan Morrison? Girl, what happened? Then another text from Daniel in accounting. Hey Rachel, I'm so sorry about your divorce. I had no idea you were married to the boss. That must have been complicated. The messages kept coming. Rachel's face burned with humiliation as she realized that every single person in the company where she'd worked for 6 years, was making the connection. The colleagues she'd complained to about her struggling husband, the work friends she'd told about finally finding a real man, the executives she'd tried to impress while married to the man who literally signed their paychecks. And Emma. God, Emma. Rachel remembered her daughter's 7th birthday just before the divorce. Emma had asked for a party at the Morrison Children's Medical Center, saying she wanted to celebrate with the other kids who used wheelchairs like she did. Rachel had thought it was depressing, had tried to convince Emma to have a party at home instead. Ethan had gently overruled her, and Emma had been radiant that day, surrounded by friends, with doctors and nurses who treated her like a princess, because her father owned the entire hospital. The cafe door chimed. Rachel looked up and felt her heart stop. Ethan Morrison walked in, and it was like seeing him for the first time. He moved with a quiet confidence she'd mistaken for passivity, wore a suit that probably cost more than her car, and every head in the cafe turned to watch him. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Rachel, he said simply, sliding into the booth across from her. I see you've checked your email. She couldn't finish the sentence. Her throat had closed around the words. A multi-billionaire? The owner of Morrison Global Industries? Yes. Ethan's gray eyes held none of the warmth she remembered. I've been all of those things throughout our entire marriage, Rachel. The question isn't who I am. The question is why you never bothered to find out. You lied to me, she managed to whisper, though the accusation felt hollow even as she spoke it. I never lied. You never asked. You made assumptions about who I was based on the fact that I didn't flash wealth, didn't drive expensive cars, didn't need to prove anything to anyone. You decided I was beneath you without ever wondering why I was always available for our daughter, why money was never actually a problem, why the mortgage was always paid, and Emma's medical care never generated bills. Rachel's mind raced back through 8 years of marriage, seeing everything through a new lens. The hospital bills? I own the hospital, Rachel. I built it specifically for children like Emma. Every child receives care regardless of their family's ability to pay. Did you really think your insurance was that good? The revelation crashed over Rachel like successive waves, each one dragging her further from shore. She thought back to their wedding day, simple and beautiful in a garden venue that she'd complained was too modest for the photo she'd wanted. She remembered now that the garden had been at Morrison Estate, though she'd never questioned who owned it or why they'd been allowed to use it for free. The wedding venue, she started. My family's property, Ethan confirmed. We own 43 acres in Waverly Hills. The house we lived in, also mine, paid in full. No mortgage. I bought it for you when we got engaged because you mentioned loving the neighborhood. Rachel felt physically ill. Every complaint she'd ever made, every disappointed sigh about their mediocre lifestyle, every comparison to other couples who had more, all of it had been said to a man who could have bought everything she'd ever wanted without denting his bank account. Why, she demanded, anger rising to cover her shame. Why would you hide something like this? What kind of man lets his wife think they're struggling? Ethan's expression hardened. The kind of man who watched his mother marry his father for money, then destroy herself trying to get more when she discovered a prenuptial agreement limited her access. The kind of man who saw every relative and childhood friend transform into something ugly when they learned about his inheritance. The kind of man who wanted just once to be loved for who he was rather than what he had. That's not fair, Rachel protested. You can't test people like that. Can I? Seems I learned exactly what I needed to know. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Rachel, when did you stop loving me? Was it after Emma's diagnosis? When you realized being a mother to a disabled child would require actual sacrifice? Or was it earlier, when you decided that a quiet, stable life wasn't enough for your Instagram feed? The barb hit home. Rachel had spent years curating a social media presence that suggested a life slightly more glamorous than the reality, posting carefully angled photos of restaurant meals and weekend trips, all while resenting that she couldn't post the luxury vacation photos her friends shared. "James said you were holding me back," she whispered. "He said I deserved better." "Ah, yes, James." Ethan's laugh was bitter. "Did he tell you he's been embezzling from the company for 4 years? Or that he's married, with a wife in Connecticut and 2 children he's been lying to just as thoroughly as he's been lying to you?" The cafe seemed to tilt. "That's not true. He's divorced. He told me." "He told you what you wanted to hear, Rachel, just like he's told his actual wife that he's been working late at the office. Would you like to call her? I have her number. Her name is Catherine Holloway. She's a kindergarten teacher. She has no idea her husband has been living a double life." Rachel's phone was already in her hand, pulling up James's contact information, searching for any clue she'd missed. His social media accounts she'd thought were private for professional reasons, the weekends he'd claimed to be visiting his sick mother in another state, the way he'd never wanted to take photos together in public places. "I had him escorted from the building 30 minutes ago," Ethan continued calmly. "He's accepted a settlement that's far more generous than he deserves, conditional on leaving the country and never contacting you or anyone at Morrison Global Industries again. By sunset tomorrow, James Holloway will be on a plane to Singapore, where his brother lives. You're welcome to join him if you'd like, though I suspect his wife might have questions about that." "This can't be happening," Rachel muttered, scrolling frantically through her phone. She found James's wife's Facebook profile within seconds. It had never been hidden. She'd simply never looked. There were photos of James from last Christmas, wearing the same watch Rachel had thought he'd bought new in January. Photos of his children, teenagers who looked exactly like him. An anniversary post from 3 months ago. 15 years with my soulmate. Rachel's cappuccino grew cold as the full magnitude of her mistakes crystallized. She'd left a multi-billionaire husband who'd loved her genuinely, abandoned a daughter who'd needed her, destroyed her reputation at a company where she'd hoped to build a career, all for a con man who'd never intended to stay. "Emma," she finally managed to say. "Can I see Emma?" Ethan's expression didn't soften. "Emma asked me last night if you were coming to her gymnastics recital this weekend." "Wheelchair gymnastics. She's been training for 8 months. I told her you were busy with your new life. She said she understood, that she hoped you were happy. My 7-year-old daughter has more grace than her mother ever possessed." The words struck Rachel like physical blows. "I want to fix this," Rachel said desperately. "Ethan, please. I made a mistake. I can see that now. We can work this out, can't we? For Emma's sake." Ethan studied her for a long moment, and Rachel saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before. Complete indifference. "For Emma's sake? You mean for the sake of the disabled child you called a burden when you were explaining to James why you wanted full custody waived?" "Yes, Rachel, I had that conversation recorded. Your attorney should have warned you that phone calls from law offices aren't privileged when you're calling from outside the office." Rachel's face went ashen. She remembered that call, made from James's car, where she'd admitted things she'd barely admitted to herself. The relief she'd felt at the thought of being free from medical appointments and special needs school meetings. The resentment that Emma's condition had trapped her in a marriage she'd grown to hate. "I was angry," she tried to explain. "I didn't mean—" "You meant every word. And that's fine, Rachel. Not every parent can handle raising a child with disabilities. But don't pretend now that you want to fix anything. The trust fund I established for Emma activated the moment our divorce was finalized. She'll receive $4.1 billion on her 18th birthday, with full access to a medical trust of $500 million immediately. The trustees, not you in case you were wondering, will ensure that Emma receives the absolute best care, education, and opportunities available." Rachel's hands clenched on the table. $4.1 billion? Our daughter has access to $500 million and you're keeping me from her? "No," Ethan corrected sharply. "You kept yourself from her when you chose to abandon her. I'm simply ensuring you can't undo that choice now that you understand the financial implications. The divorce decree you sign grants you supervised visitation rights only, and only if Emma requests it. So far, she hasn't." The truth of that statement hurt more than Rachel expected. She remembered Emma's face the day she'd moved out, the way her daughter had simply nodded and said, "Okay, Mommy. I hope you're happy." No tears, no tantrums, just quiet acceptance that her mother was leaving. "What happens now?" Rachel asked quietly. "Now? You continue your life. You're still employed at Morrison Global Industries. I won't punish you professionally for personal failures. You're talented at your job, but you'll report to a new supervisor and you'll be transferred to the Seattle office, effective immediately. Consider it a fresh start, away from everyone who now knows your story." "You're exiling me." "I'm offering you mercy you don't deserve," Ethan countered. "You could stay here and face the whispers, the judgment, the constant reminders of what you gave up. Or you can start over in Seattle with a generous salary, full benefits, and the opportunity to build a new life without your mistakes following you." Your choice. Rachel wanted to argue, to fight, to demand something, anything that would let her reclaim some dignity. But she'd lost the right to make demands the day she'd signed away her daughter for a con man in a Porsche. "The Seattle offer stands for 72 hours, Ethan said, standing to leave. "After that, I'll assume you've declined and your resignation will be processed. Your severance package will be substantial, $180,000 contingent on a non-disclosure agreement regarding my identity and our marriage. You'll be comfortable, Rachel. You'll just be comfortable somewhere else, living with the consequences of choosing money over family." "But I didn't choose money," Rachel protested. "I didn't know you had any." Ethan paused, looked back at her with something that might have been pity. "Exactly. You chose what you thought was money, James's Porsche, his penthouse, his promises of a better life, over authentic love, family, and commitment. You chose the appearance of wealth over the reality of it. That should tell you everything you need to know about yourself." He walked toward the door, then stopped once more. "Emma's gymnastics recital is Saturday at 2 p.m. at Morrison Children's Medical Center. If you attend, sit in the back. Don't approach her unless she comes to you first. Despite everything you've done, she deserves the chance to decide if she wants her mother in her life. But Rachel, if you hurt her again, if you disappoint her one more time, there's no corner of this earth where my resources won't find you and ensure you regret it. Am I clear?" Rachel nodded wordlessly, tears streaming down her face. Ethan Morrison walked out of the cafe, leaving behind the woman who'd divorced a multi-billionaire without knowing it, abandoned a disabled child for a con man, and learned too late that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in the people who love you when you have nothing left to offer but yourself.